Her voice rang out across 300 guests, steady and unshakable. Loyalty without truth destroys the very thing it's meant to protect. The screen behind the altar blazed with proof her father had spent decades trying to bury. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her father's face drained of all color. The man who had controlled every narrative, every image, every silence was about to lose everything he'd built on lies. And the truth was just beginning to surface. I've taken photos in combat zones, refugee camps, and military funerals, but nothing prepared me for my sister's wedding. Coming home to Austin after a decade in uniform felt strange, like stepping into a photograph that had faded while I was away. Everything looked smaller, quieter, more polished, as if the city had been holding its breath, waiting for me to notice how much I'd changed while it stood still. My name is Callie Delaney. For most of my adult life, I served as a visual documentation specialist in the U.S. Army Public Affairs Division. I've been the one behind the camera, the one documenting other people's chaos, their victories, their losses, their moments of truth. This time, the chaos belonged to my own family, and the truth I would capture would shatter everything we'd built our lives around. My sister Elara was getting married to Tristan Price, the golden boy son of Senator Harold Price. Tristan was the kind of man who probably had a LinkedIn profile before he could drive, the kind who shook hands with calculated warmth and remembered your name just long enough to use it twice in conversation. Their wedding was all anyone in my family could talk about for months, as if this single event could erase years of unspoken tension, of secrets buried so deep we'd forgotten they were there. The Delaneys were a military legacy, the kind of family whose name appeared on plaques and in speeches about duty and sacrifice. My father, Colonel Barrett Delaney, had retired after 35 years of service. Now he ran Falcon Ridge Systems, a defense contracting company that paid for the house with its spotless lawn, the luxury cars in the driveway, and probably every white rose at this wedding. The company's logo appeared on everything from military bases to congressional briefings. To the outside world, Barrett Delaney was a hero. Inside our family, he was the commanding officer who never stopped giving orders. I was supposed to be home for 3 weeks of leave, a brief pause before my next deployment. My father had other plans. He extended that into a full-blown family assignment without asking. "You'll handle the photos, right, Callie?" His tone made it clear it wasn't a question. "You've got the training. You've got the eye." Translation: don't just be a guest. Work for free and make us look perfect. Make sure the world sees exactly what we want them to see. Nothing more, nothing less. When I walked into our old house, the smell of furniture polish and fresh flowers hit me like walking into a formal inspection. The air itself felt controlled, manufactured. My mother was in full hostess mode, her voice carrying through the hallways as she directed caterers like she was commanding an airstrike. Every detail mattered. Every imperfection was a threat. Elara was upstairs trying on her dress, surrounded by bridesmaids who looked more like public relations staff than friends. They smiled on cue, adjusted fabric with practiced precision, and spoke in the careful tones of people who knew they were performing. My father stood in the hallway below, arms crossed, radiating that command presence that never truly leaves a career officer. Even in retirement, he carried that energy, the kind that made people straighten their backs when he entered a room. The kind that made you feel like you were constantly being evaluated. "Callie," he said, gripping my shoulder with the firm pressure of a man who measures affection in pounds per square inch. "Good to have you home." His eyes held mine for a moment too long. This wedding means a lot for the family, for the company, for our name. The weight of those words settled on my shoulders like armor I hadn't asked to wear. I smiled and nodded the way you do when you hear something you've already memorized. Something you've been hearing your entire life in different variations. Delaney honor. Delaney pride. Delaney legacy. The words had stopped feeling like inspiration years ago. Now they just felt like chains. Falcon Ridge Systems had been in the news recently. Nothing overtly scandalous, just whispers about contract delays, missing reports, audits that seem to drag on longer than they should. The kind of rumors that circulate in the defense world like smoke, visible enough to notice but too diffuse to grasp. Still, I could tell my father was under pressure. Every word he spoke carried extra weight. Every gesture was more controlled than usual. Every smile was a little too fixed. To him, this marriage wasn't just about love or companionship or two people building a life together. It was a strategic merger. Delaney honor meets political power. Military legacy unites with senatorial influence. It was a contract disguised as a ceremony. When I finally saw Alara in her wedding dress, she looked beautiful in that flawless, untouchable way that belongs on magazine covers. The dress fit perfectly. Her makeup was impeccable. Her hair fell in precisely styled waves. But behind the smile, something was wrong. Her eyes looked glassy, distant, like she was staring at something the rest of us couldn't see. When she hugged me, she felt fragile, like she was holding herself together with nothing but willpower and expensive cosmetics. "You okay?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice low enough that the bridesmaids wouldn't hear. "Of course," she said too fast, her smile brightening with obvious effort. "It's just a lot of planning. You know how Dad gets." Yeah, I knew. Growing up, Delaney meant learning early that family comes first and feelings come last. My father believed in discipline, in control, in not letting emotion interfere with mission objectives. That philosophy worked in the army, where clear chains of command and suppressed emotions could mean the difference between success and failure. In real life, in a family, it just made everyone exhausted. It turned love into duty and duty into burden. The rehearsal dinner that night could have been mistaken for a defense industry gala. Senators mingled with retired generals. Corporate board members exchanged business cards with military contractors. Everybody wore practice smiles, the kind that didn't quite reach their eyes. My father opened the evening with a toast about tradition, honor, and the strength of two proud families. It sounded less like a father welcoming his daughter's marriage and more like a commanding officer delivering a briefing before deployment. People clapped politely, the sound hollow in the vast dining room. Alara stared at the tablecloth, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric. I started taking photos, partly for practice, partly to stay busy, partly because looking through a lens gave me permission to observe without participating. Through the viewfinder, I caught moments most people missed. Elara's smile fading the instant Tristan looked away, like a light switching off. My mother's nervous hand squeezing my father's arm every time someone mentioned Falcon Ridge, her knuckles going white with tension. And my father himself scanning the room constantly, his eyes moving with the vigilance of a man guarding a secret he couldn't afford to lose. After dessert, I stepped outside, needing air that didn't taste like performance and pressure. I'd quit smoking years ago, but sometimes the habit isn't about nicotine. It's about silence. It's about finding a space where you're not being watched or evaluated or expected to maintain the perfect Delaney composure. The backyard looked exactly the same as when I was 16. The same trimmed hedges, the same flagpole standing at attention. The same swing set my father refused to get rid of because Delaney's don't waste functional equipment. I could hear laughter from inside, the manufactured kind that sounds like it's being performed for an audience. When I turned around, my father was behind me, his footsteps silent despite his size. "You're not drinking, are you?" he asked, his tone carrying that edge of concern that always felt more like surveillance than care. "Water," I said, raising an imaginary glass. "You'd be proud." He nodded slowly, his expression softening just slightly. "I am proud. You've served well, Callie. You represent the Delaney name the right way." He paused, and I waited for what I knew was coming. "You'll get some great shots tomorrow," he continued, his voice taking on that commanding tone again. "We need everything documented properly. This isn't just a wedding, it's a statement." That word statement stuck with me, settling uncomfortably in my chest. Weddings are supposed to be about people, about love, about two lives choosing to intertwine. In our family, everything was about image. Everything was about what the world saw and believed. The truth was just raw material to be shaped into something more useful. Later that night, while backing up my equipment and checking battery levels, Alara knocked on my door. She wore her silk robe and carried a glass of wine she clearly hadn't touched, the liquid still at the exact level the server had poured. She sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the floor, her breathing slow and measured like she was trying to control something deeper than just her breath. "Do you ever feel like your life's been decided for you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All the time," I said. "Comes with the uniform. You stop making choices and start following orders." She laughed weakly, the sound hollow and sad. "I thought so. I used to think marrying Tristan was what I wanted. I told myself I loved him, that this was my choice. But now?" She trailed off, her hands gripping the wine glass like it was the only solid thing in the room. "Now I don't know what I want. I don't even know if I remember how to want something that's actually mine." I looked at her reflection in my mirror. seeing past the perfect exterior to the exhaustion underneath. You sound like you already made a decision. You just haven't said it out loud yet. She didn't answer. She just sighed, set the wine glass on my nightstand, and left the room without another word. The glass sat there untouched all night, a silent testament to all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to say. The next morning arrived with light that was too bright, too perfect. The kind of light photographers dream about, but that felt almost cruel in its clarity. The Falcon Ridge estate where the wedding was being held looked like something out of a political campaign commercial. Everything from the floral arch to the white chairs lined up in perfect military precision. This wasn't just a venue. It was a stage set for a performance we'd all been rehearsing our entire lives. I started setting up early, adjusting my equipment while the morning dew still clung to the grass. Drones flew overhead for aerial coverage. Public relations staff from both families moved through the space with clipboards and earpieces, their faces set in professional determination. If you didn't know better, you'd think the president himself was attending. My father did a quick walkthrough, inspecting everything with the thoroughness of a commander before a major operation. "Make sure to get shots of the officials in attendance," he told me, his eyes not meeting mine. "We'll need them for the press release." "Press release?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "For a wedding?" He gave me a look that meant, don't question it. That look that had silenced me countless times throughout my childhood. I didn't push. I'd learned long ago that questioning my father in public only made things worse. By noon, guests began arriving. Generals in dress uniforms, senators with practiced smiles, corporate donors who looked too polished to sweat even in the Texas heat. I snapped photos smiling at people I didn't know, pretending not to notice how mechanical it all felt, how every gesture seemed choreographed. When Alara arrived in her wedding dress, everyone gasped. She looked perfect again, exactly as our father wanted her to look. Every detail immaculate, every hair in place. But when she caught my eye, there was something raw there, something desperate. Fear, maybe. Or maybe guilt. I couldn't tell yet. But I recognized that look. I'd seen it on the faces of soldiers right before they walked into situations they knew were wrong, but couldn't find the courage to refuse. During the group portraits, I caught little details through my lens. Her hand trembling slightly when Tristan touched her back, the way her fingers curled involuntarily, as if bracing for impact. Her smile fading the moment she turned away from the camera, dropping like a mask she could only hold for so long. She was performing happiness with the dedication of someone who'd been trained to hide their pain. And my camera saw right through every carefully constructed lie. I've spent years photographing soldiers under fire, documenting people who smiled for morale while their world fell apart around them. That same expression was written all over Alara's face. The false brightness in her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way she held her body like it didn't quite belong to her anymore. By late afternoon, everything was ready. Guests seated in perfect rows. Musicians tuned and waiting. Champagne poured into crystal glasses that caught the light like tiny prisms. From the outside, it was flawless. A perfect day for a perfect wedding. But inside, I could feel something tightening in the air. Like the electric pressure before a storm, that moment when the atmosphere itself seems to be holding its breath. I took a step back to check my frame, adjusting my angle to capture the full scope of the scene. And for half a second through my viewfinder, I saw something that didn't belong. A man standing far in the background, partially obscured by trees, wearing a military uniform that looked somehow wrong, not quite formal enough for a guest, not quite casual enough for staff. He was watching the bride with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. I blinked, refocusing my lens. The man was gone. But the image of that uniform burned in my mind long after the figure disappeared. My hands felt colder than they should have. Maybe it was nothing, I told myself. Just a guest with a military background. But deep down, something in my training refused to accept that explanation. I knew something about that posture, those squared shoulders, the way he stood with the balanced readiness of someone who'd been trained to move quickly, someone who belonged to the same dangerous world I did. Back inside, my father was giving orders to the catering team, as if he was still commanding a battalion, his voice carrying that tone of absolute authority that brooked no argument. The way he moved, the way everyone reacted to his presence, it was pure muscle memory. Discipline disguised as hospitality. Control disguised as care. He lived by one rule that had guided his entire career: control the narrative before it controls you. In our house, that rule wasn't just about military operations or business dealings. It was our entire upbringing, the foundation on which everything else was built. From the time Alara and I could walk, we were trained in routine: early morning runs before school, spotless rooms subject to random inspection, firm handshakes practiced until they became automatic, and zero emotional outbursts ever. Delaney's keep their composure, my father would say whenever we cried or questioned him, his voice flat and final. He didn't raise daughters. He raised soldiers, and soldiers don't break down. They don't complain. They don't question orders. That mindset made sense in the army, where emotional control could mean the difference between life and death. But inside a family, it just created silence. Real silence. The kind that makes you forget how to say what you feel. The kind that turns love into something you demonstrate through obedience rather than connection. While everyone else was focused on adjusting floral arrangements and checking seating charts, I kept thinking about that flash of uniform in the distance. I told myself not to overthink it, to focus on my job. But the instinct I'd built over years of active duty didn't switch off just because I was at a wedding. I was trained to notice what didn't belong, to identify threats before they fully materialized. And something about that figure felt like a threat, or maybe a warning. Around midday, my mother found me at the edge of the garden, where I was adjusting my lens settings in preparation for the ceremony. "You're doing great, sweetheart," she said, her voice tight and polite in that way she had of making even compliments sound like official statements. She always spoke like she was in a press conference, every word carefully chosen and approved. "Thanks. How's Alara holding up?" "She's fine." The answer came instantly, too practiced. "She's just nervous. All brides are nervous on their wedding day." Her tone was too quick, too smooth, too rehearsed. She didn't even look at me when she said it. When my mother lies, she fixes her eyes on something just past your shoulder, finding a point of focus that lets her avoid direct eye contact. Right now, she was staring at the champagne table as if the arrangement of glasses required intense concentration. That evening felt less like a family gathering and more like a political fundraiser. Everyone who attended could have been on a defense contractor payroll. The conversations I overheard weren't about joy or celebration. They were about contracts, about legislation, about strategic partnerships. My father gave another speech, this time about family legacy and national duty, speaking about honor as if it were a product he was still actively selling to the highest bidder. Tristan sat beside him, smiling with that calculated, performative charm that had probably been taught to him alongside table manners. He was the kind of man who shook hands with interns just long enough to remember their first names but not their faces. The kind who saw people as networking opportunities rather than human beings. I noticed Alara picking at her food, barely eating, moving pieces around her plate in patterns that suggested she was trying to look busy rather than actually consuming anything. When she caught me looking, she smiled that same stiff, camera-ready smile that I'd seen 1,000 times before. It reminded me of the expression soldiers wear during homecoming ceremonies, the kind that hides the cracks underneath. The kind that says I'm fine when everything inside is screaming the opposite. After dinner, Tristan raised his glass for a toast. "To the Delaney and Price families," he announced, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease. "Two legacies united in strength, in purpose, in commitment to serving this great nation." Applause followed like clockwork. Cameras flashed. My father looked like he'd just secured another multi-million-dollar contract. I took a sip of water, feeling a tightness in my throat that had nothing to do with thirst. Maybe it was pride in my family's accomplishments, or maybe it was dread at what those accomplishments had cost us. Later, when the guests finally left and the house fell into uneasy quiet, I helped pack up my camera gear. My father stopped by the equipment table, resting a hand on my shoulder with that mixture of affection and control that characterized all his gestures. "Make sure you capture the right moments tomorrow," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Not every photo needs to tell the truth. Some need to tell the right story." That line sat heavy in my chest. The right story. Not the true one. I'd heard commanders say things like that before press briefings, before missions that would later be classified, before operations that required carefully managed public narratives. But I'd never heard it before a wedding. The implications made my stomach turn. When I went upstairs, Alara's room door was half open. Through the gap, I caught a glimpse of her sitting on the floor in her pajamas, Her veil spread across her lap like a discarded costume. She was staring at her phone, her face drawn and pale, her entire body, radiating a kind of defeat I'd only seen in people who'd lost something irreplaceable. She looked up and noticed me watching. "I'm okay," she said automatically, the words coming out with the mechanical precision of someone who'd said them too many times to count. "You sure?" She nodded, then added quietly, her voice barely carrying across the room. "Dad says it's important. The wedding, I mean. For the company. For him. For maintaining our family's position." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "And for you?" She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we'd been taught not to say. "I guess if he's happy, it's good for everyone," she finally said, her voice flat and resigned. "That's what matters, right? The greater good." That was classic Delaney logic, measuring love by usefulness, evaluating relationships by their strategic value. I sat beside her on the floor, studying the framed photos on her dresser. My father in dress uniform, medals gleaming. Ella's college graduation, her smile bright and forced. Family Christmas cards where we all smiled like we believed the script we'd been given. Every single image looked perfect, professionally composed, carefully lit. None of them looked real. "You don't have to do this if you don't want to," I said finally, my voice careful but firm. She gave a small, bitter laugh. "You think walking away is an option?" "This isn't just a wedding, Callie. It's an alliance. That's what Dad called it. He actually used that word. Alliance. Like we're nations negotiating a treaty rather than people trying to build a life." She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "He said this marriage will secure Falcon Ridge's future, that it will protect everything he's built, that it's my duty to the family, to his legacy, to everyone who depends on the company. The military had taught me how to handle stress, how to function under pressure, how to maintain composure when everything around me was falling apart. But nothing in my training had prepared me for watching my sister turn into collateral damage in our father's endless war to protect his empire. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the estate, checking lighting conditions and planning my shots. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass and expensive perfume, that manufactured combination of nature and wealth. Staff were everywhere, event planners with headsets, florists making last-minute adjustments, Falcon Ridge public relations representatives with clipboards who moved through the space like intelligence officers gathering information. That's when I overheard two of the staff talking near the equipment tents, their voices low but not quite low enough. "Falcon Ridge can't afford another headline," one whispered, glancing around nervously. "Not after the Syria mess," the other agreed. "They're lucky the colonel's daughter is marrying into the Price family. This wedding is the perfect distraction. Perfect timing." I froze mid-step, my camera suddenly feeling heavier in my hands. Syria. My unit had rotated through there 2 years earlier on a documentation assignment. I remembered the name Falcon Ridge appearing in one of our supply briefings, defective optical equipment, faulty body armor, gear that should never have passed inspection. Equipment that cost lives. I'd never known my father's company was directly tied to it. I'd assumed it was just another contractor cutting corners, another faceless corporation prioritizing profit over safety. The thought made my stomach twist with a sickening realization. I snapped a few photos to cover my reaction, pretending to adjust focus while my mind raced through implications I didn't want to face. Inside, Elara was getting her makeup done, surrounded by stylists who worked with the precision of surgical teams. She looked stunning in a tragic kind of way, like a sacrifice being prepared for an altar. Every detail perfect: hair, jewelry, posture. Only her eyes betrayed her, holding a grief she couldn't quite hide no matter how much makeup they applied. When she saw me, she whispered through a forced smile, "Smile for the camera, right?" That's all anyone wants. It sounded like a joke, but the sadness underneath it cut deeper than any accusation could have. My father walked in moments later, looking sharp in his tailored suit, military medals pinned to his lapel like trophies from a war no one else remembered. "You look beautiful," he told Elara, his voice softening for the first time that week, showing a glimpse of the father I remembered from childhood, before duty consumed everything else. But then, without missing a beat, the softness vanished. "Remember, today isn't just about you," he added, his tone returning to that commanding edge. "This is about legacy, about honor, about protecting what we've built." Elara nodded, her reflection in the mirror still as stone, her expression carefully blank. I took a few test shots, adjusting exposure and checking composition. My hands were steady, years of training ensured that, but my chest felt tight, my breath shallow. Through the lens, I saw what no one else in that room wanted to see. A woman rehearsing how to hide her fear. A daughter preparing to sacrifice herself for her father's empire. "Everything's perfect," my father said behind me, his voice carrying satisfaction. "No surprises, no disruptions. That's how Delaney's do things. We maintain control." He walked out to greet the arriving guests, his posture straight and confident. The moment he left, Ilara's shoulders dropped like she'd been holding her breath for hours, like the weight of his presence had been physically pressing her down. She looked at me through the mirror, her eyes meeting mine with desperate honesty. "Do you ever wish you'd just run away and started over?" she asked quietly. Just disappeared and became someone else. Someone who wasn't carrying all this weight. Every deployment, I admitted. Every time I leave, part of me wonders what it would be like to just never come back. To let Callie Delaney die in some official report and start fresh somewhere no one knows my name. She laughed quietly, shaking her head. Must be nice to have that choice. To have an escape route built into your job description. I was about to respond when a movement outside the window caught my eye. A shadow by the tree line, half hidden behind the gazebo, standing with the stillness of someone trained to observe without being observed. The same figure from before. My pulse jumped. I lifted my camera again, zooming in carefully. The autofocus locked onto a man's face, tired eyes, close-cropped hair, a faded uniform that had seen combat, and a face I recognized from deployment briefings, from memorial pages, from reports marked classified. Captain Reed Corbett, and he wasn't supposed to be alive. The second I recognized Reed Corbett through my lens, my hands froze on the camera. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, that exhaustion and stress were creating hallucinations. The man had been listed as missing in action 3 years ago. His name had been printed on a military memorial page, complete with a flag-draped coffin photo that I'd seen in our unit's briefing room. I remembered the day the report came through. We were still overseas, still documenting the aftermath of failed operations we weren't supposed to question. We'd heard the rumors about one of Falcon Ridge's supply missions going catastrophically wrong. No survivors. Equipment failure in hostile territory. The kind of tragedy that gets classified quickly, its details buried under layers of national security protocols. Captain Reed Corbett was dead. That was the official story. That was what everyone believed. Except the man standing in the garden wasn't a ghost. He was real, solid, breathing. Through my lens, I watched him standing half in shadow, scanning the scene with the calm awareness of someone used to danger, someone who'd learned to assess threats before they fully materialized. He didn't move like a guest or a worker. He moved like a soldier assessing a perimeter, identifying exits and vulnerabilities with unconscious precision. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the landscaping with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years learning how to vanish. I lowered the camera. My pulse was steady. Training does that to you, keeps your body calm even when your mind is racing. But my thoughts were running through every impossible explanation I could imagine. Either Falcon Ridge had faked his death or someone else had. Someone with enough power to manipulate military records, to create false casualty reports, to erase a living man from official existence. And somehow, inexplicably, my sister's wedding had just become ground zero for whatever secret that man carried. Inside, everything looked normal again. My father was laughing too loudly with Senator Price, their conversation probably more about political alliances than family connections. The string quartet was rehearsing, filling the air with elegant classical music. The house buzzed with that shallow joy that rich people mistake for happiness, that performance of celebration that has nothing to do with actual emotion. I needed to confirm what I'd seen. I checked my photos, scrolling back through my recent shots. There he was, blurry in the background, but unmistakable. The timestamp didn't lie. Milica 7 a.m., Falcon Ridge Estate. Captain Reed Corbett, supposedly dead for 3 years, was here. Alive. Watching. When I went upstairs to find Ilara, she was sitting in front of the vanity while her bridesmaids gossiped around her, their conversations superficial and meaningless. Her face was flawless, calm in that practiced way that looked peaceful from a distance but revealed nothing up close. I waited until the bridesmaids left, chattering about champagne and flower arrangements before asking quietly, "Hey, Ilara. Quick question. Did you see someone outside earlier, near the trees by the gazebo?" Her reflection stiffened for half a second, a micro-expression so brief that most people would have missed it. But I was trained to catch these moments. No, she said softly, too carefully. Just staff preparing. Why? I thought I recognized someone from the army, I said, watching her face for any reaction. Someone who shouldn't be here. Someone who shouldn't be anywhere. Maybe you're just tired from traveling, she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Your mind playing tricks. You know how stress does that? Maybe. But we both knew that wasn't true. And the way she wouldn't meet my eyes told me she knew exactly who I'd seen. A knock interrupted us. My father poked his head in, his expression pleasant but his eyes sharp and assessing. Everything good here? Perfect, Elara said quickly, her voice brightening with obvious effort. He nodded, satisfied. Tristan's family will be here in 20 minutes. Let's keep things smooth. We can't afford any disruptions. Understood? Understood, Elara repeated, the word coming out like a soldier acknowledging orders. When he left, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath underwater, her entire body sagging slightly. I noticed a faint bruise near her wrist, half hidden under her silver bracelet. The discoloration was subtle, easily missed unless you were looking for it. My instincts kicked in before my brain could stop them. Before I could consider whether I really wanted to know the answer. What happened to your arm? She pulled her sleeve down quickly, her movements defensive. Nothing. Just bumped it on a door yesterday. You know how clumsy I get when I'm stressed. The answer came too fast, too rehearsed, too clean. I didn't push. Not yet. But I filed the information away. Another piece of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. The rest of the morning went by in slow motion, each minute stretching longer than it should. Tristan arrived in his navy suit, smiling like a campaign advertisement, all white teeth and calculated charm. He shook hands with my father, kissed Elara's cheek with perfunctory affection, and whispered something in her ear that made her go pale, all the colour draining from her face in an instant. From behind my camera, I caught every micro-expression. Her barely perceptible flinch when his hand touched her waist, his smirk when he thought no one was watching. My father's approving nod as he observed their interaction, satisfied that his plan was proceeding exactly as designed. When you photograph people long enough, you stop seeing what they say and start seeing what they mean. Body language becomes a language you read fluently. And right now, Elara's body was screaming warnings that no one else seemed to hear. I moved outside to shoot candids of the arriving guests, using the excuse of documentation to observe without seeming to observe. The air smelled like cut roses and barely suppressed tension. I caught snippets of conversations as I moved through the crowd, senators discussing upcoming defense contracts, wives comparing jewelry with competitive politeness, a general bragging about new drone technology with barely contained excitement. Everyone here was connected to Falcon Ridge somehow. Contractors, legislators, military brass. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a networking event disguised as a celebration. Then I spotted him again. Reed. This time standing near the service gate, talking to one of the groundskeepers in low, urgent tones. He looked leaner than I remembered, his face marked by sun and hardship. But those sharp, intelligent eyes hadn't changed. They held the same intensity I remembered from briefings, from classified meetings, from moments when lives depended on paying attention to details others might miss. I kept my camera low and walked closer, pretending to adjust settings while actually just trying to get within earshot. When I was near enough to hear fragments of their conversation, he turned and looked straight at me. Recognition flickered across his face, not surprise, just quiet acknowledgement, like he'd expected me to find him eventually. Sergeant Delaney, he said under his breath, his voice low enough that only I could hear. Didn't think I'd see you here. I froze mid-step, my training the only thing keeping my expression neutral. Hearing my rank from a dead man felt surreal, like reality had fractured and I'd stepped through into some alternate version of events. Captain Corbett, I said cautiously, my voice barely above a whisper. That's impossible. You're supposed to be dead. Not impossible, he replied, his expression grim. Just inconvenient for certain people. He glanced toward the house, his gaze shifting subtly toward an upstairs window. Elara's room. The gesture was brief but unmistakable. Before I could respond, a security guard passed by on routine patrol. Reed stepped back into the shadows, his movement fluid and practiced. You didn't see me, Delaney, he said, his voice carrying a warning. Not yet. Not until the right moment. Then he was gone again, slipping around the corner like smoke, like someone who'd spent years learning how to disappear without leaving traces. I stood there, my heartbeat steady, my mind spinning through implications and connections I didn't want to face. If Reed was alive and connected to my sister, then this wedding wasn't a celebration. It was camouflage for something far more dangerous. It was a performance designed to bury truths that powerful people needed to stay buried. Back inside, the photographer in me went on autopilot. I took pictures because it gave my hands something to do while my brain replayed Reed's words. Analyzed his presence, tried to understand what kind of conspiracy I'd just stumbled into. The familiar weight of my camera became an anchor keeping me grounded. I caught candids of guests arriving, of families greeting each other with embraces that looked warm but felt calculated. Every smile seemed to hide something. Every conversation seemed to carry subtext I was only beginning to decode. When I passed my father near the grand ballroom, he was talking to Tristan and two Falcon Ridge executives I recognized from corporate materials. Their tone was low, sharp, clipped in that way people talk when they're discussing sensitive matters they don't want overheard. I caught a few words as I passed contract renewal, managing the narrative, controlling public perception. Not the kind of words you hear about wedding flowers and seating arrangements. My father noticed me approaching. "Need something, Callie?" he asked, his voice pleasant but his eyes calculating. "Just getting some pre-ceremony shots," I said, forcing a smile that I hoped looked natural. He smiled back, but there was suspicion behind his eyes. That assessment that made me feel like I was being evaluated for hidden motives. Good. Let's make sure everything about today stays picture perfect. No surprises, no complications. We've worked too hard for anything to go wrong now. The subtext was clear: don't interfere. Don't question. Do your job and nothing more. I went upstairs to check on Alara again. She was alone this time, staring at her reflection like she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. The makeup, the hair, the dress, it all looked like a costume she'd been forced to wear. "You saw him, didn't you?" I asked quietly, closing the door behind me. She didn't move, didn't pretend not to understand. "Who?" But her voice lacked conviction. "You know who?" Reed Corbett. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, her jaw tightening with the effort of maintaining control. He shouldn't have come. He's putting himself in danger just by being here. "Why is he here, Alara?" She shook her head, her expression desperate. "Please, Callie, just let it go. Pretend you didn't see him. Pretend this is just a normal wedding. Please." That phrase, "let it go," is usually what people say when they're terrified of what truth might reveal. When they've been living with fear for so long that it feels safer than freedom. She turned to face me then, her voice low but steady with a kind of resigned courage. "Do you ever wish you'd done something differently? Chosen truth over orders? Chosen what was right over what was safe?" I blinked, confused. That's the same thing. Truth and duty, orders and righteousness. They're supposed to be aligned. "No," she said, her voice carrying years of buried realization. "Not always. Sometimes duty means protecting lies. Sometimes orders mean becoming complicit in something you know is wrong." There it was again, that Delaney crack in the armor. That moment when the facade we'd been trained to maintain starts breaking under the pressure of reality. It happens when truth starts pressing too hard against the lie, when the weight of silence becomes heavier than the risk of speaking. Before I could ask more, a public relations coordinator burst in, announcing with artificial brightness that it was time for family portraits. Alara straightened immediately, her mask sliding back into place, tears vanishing as if they'd never existed. She followed the woman out, leaving me with nothing but questions and a sinking certainty that this day wasn't going to end the way anyone planned. Out on the manicured lawn, the families lined up for pictures, arranging themselves with practiced precision. My father stood front and center like a general commanding his own parade, his posture radiating authority. Tristan beside him, Alara on his other side. Everyone posed perfectly, smiling on cue, demonstrating years of practice at presenting exactly the image the world expected to see. I did my job, mechanically checked lighting, adjusted exposure, snapped frame after frame. But between the clicks, something broke through the carefully maintained performance. Off to the side, partially hidden by ornamental hedges, I caught another glimpse of Reed. He wasn't watching the ceremony set up this time. He was watching Alara, and the way she looked back just for a second, just one brief moment when she thought no one would notice, told me everything I needed to know. Her whole face changed. The tension dropped from her shoulders. She smiled, really smiled, with genuine emotion breaking through for the first time all day. It wasn't the trained, perfect Delaney smile we'd been taught to deploy like weapons. It was the kind of expression that belongs to someone who remembers what freedom feels like, what love feels like, what it means to be seen rather than just observed. It was the smile of someone catching a glimpse of a life they'd been forced to give up. I raised my camera instinctively and took the shot. The photo captured something raw and real and undeniably true. Elara mid-laugh, her hand unconsciously reaching toward where Reed stood. Sunlight cutting through the leaves like a spotlight illuminating something that had been hidden too long in darkness. And then, like a switch flipping, my father's voice shattered the moment. "Elara, we're ready for the next shot. Focus, please." Her smile vanished instantly, completely as if it had never existed. She stepped back into formation. Her face neutral, her posture perfect, her expression carefully empty. But the damage was done, because in that single frame, I had just captured the truth that could burn down everything my family had built. I had documented the secret that powerful people had killed to keep buried. My finger hovered over the shutter button longer than it should have, my training warring with my conscience. Even after the formal portraits ended, my mind stayed on that image, the laugh, the look between them. The unmistakable connection that shouldn't exist according to the official narrative. I'd seen people risk their lives for love in war zones, had documented soldiers making impossible choices based on bonds deeper than duty. But this was different. This was quiet rebellion dressed in pearls and silk. This was truth hiding in plain sight, protected only by everyone's willingness to look away. After the last posed shot, I told my assistant I needed to back up the files. Really, I just needed a moment alone to process what I'd captured. In the equipment tent, I scrolled through the shots, pretending to check focus and exposure while actually staring at that one image that changed everything. There it was. Elara and Reed in a fraction of a second that didn't belong to anyone else, that existed outside the official narrative, outside my father's carefully controlled story. I zoomed in, studying details. The look in her eyes wasn't just happiness. It was recognition, memory, love that had survived years of separation and official denial. It was the look that said, "You're not supposed to be here, but seeing you reminds me of who I used to be before they turned me into someone else." I copied the photo to a backup drive, labeled it something innocuous that wouldn't attract attention, and slipped the SD card into my pocket. Old habits die hard. You never leave sensitive material lying around. Not in a war zone, and apparently not in my family's backyard either. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. "Still working, Sergeant." The voice was low, steady. Carrying authority despite speaking barely above a whisper. I turned. Reed was there, standing just outside the tent flap, his expression unreadable. His uniform was plain, stripped of insignia and rank, but his stance was pure army. I hadn't seen him up close in years, but time had carved deeper lines into his face, the kind you only get from captivity, from trauma, from guilt that never stops eating at you. "You shouldn't be here," I said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being observed. "Neither should you," he said. "You know what your father's really up to?" His tone made my stomach tighten with dread I didn't want to acknowledge. "You're going to have to be more specific. My father's up to a lot of things." He glanced around, lowering his voice even further. "Falcon Ridge. The contracts. Syria. You really think all those reports about malfunctioning armor were just clerical errors? Bureaucratic mistakes?" I didn't answer. The story was old news inside the army rumors about a failed equipment batch that had cost American lives. Falcon Ridge had denied everything, of course. Released carefully worded statements about meeting all specifications, about unfortunate battlefield conditions beyond anyone's control. And the Pentagon had moved on, the way it always does when investigations become politically inconvenient. Reed took a step closer, his voice dropping to barely audible. I filed a report about that mission. About what really happened. Detailed everything, the faulty equipment, the test results that were falsified, the corners that were cut to meet deadlines and maximize profit margins. Next day, I was listed as missing in action. Convenient timing, don't you think? "You're saying my father, I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't make myself voice the accusation out loud." "I'm saying someone with authority buried that report," Reed said, his expression grim. "Maybe he didn't pull the trigger himself. Maybe he didn't personally order my unit into that situation. But he signed the paperwork that kept it quiet. He approved the cover-up that turned dead soldiers into acceptable losses and living witnesses into missing casualties. I stared at him, weighing his words like evidence, analyzing his tone for signs of deception or exaggeration. In the army, you learn to read truth not through tears or dramatic emotion, but through consistency, through the small details that liars always get wrong. His voice was calm, controlled, almost emotionless. Too calm for someone making false accusations. Too detailed for someone inventing stories. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. "I didn't come for you," he said simply. "I came for her." He looked past me toward the house, toward where Ilara was probably finishing final preparations. "Ilara doesn't know I made it back until last week. I thought she'd be safer if she believed I was dead. But now your father's trying to lock everything down by binding Falcon Ridge to the Price family. Once this wedding happens, once the families are legally connected, the paper trail disappears forever. Too much political power combined. Too many people invested in maintaining the story. So you thought crashing her wedding would fix that?" I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. "I thought showing her I was alive might give her a choice she didn't know she had," he said. "I thought maybe she deserved to know that someone survived, that the truth didn't die in Syria along with my squad. I wanted to believe he was noble, wanted to think this was purely about justice and truth. But I'd seen too many good soldiers do monumentally stupid things for love, had documented the wreckage that resulted when emotion overtook training. Still, the pain in his eyes wasn't something you could fake. Whatever had happened in Syria had broken something fundamental in him, and Ilara was the only thread still connecting him to who he used to be before everything fell apart. "You can't be here," I said again, more urgently this time. "If my father sees you, if he realizes you're alive and here at this wedding, this doesn't end with a family argument. It ends with security dragging you out in restraints. It ends with you disappearing again, this time permanently." He gave a bitter half-smile that held no humor. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to make me vanish. I hesitated before asking the question that really mattered. Why now? Why today of all days? His expression shifted, becoming almost vulnerable. "Because this is the day she loses the last part of herself that's still hers to control. Once she signs those marriage documents, once she becomes Mrs. Tristan Price, she belongs to the machine, the same machine that almost killed me, that covered up deaths to protect profit margins, that turns human beings into acceptable losses in quarterly reports." Something in his voice, in the raw honesty of those words, made me believe him completely. This wasn't about revenge or disruption. It was about giving someone he loved one final chance to choose a different path. Before I could reply, my father's voice boomed from the lawn, cutting through the afternoon air like a command. "Callie, we're moving to the reception setup. Need those group shots completed in 15 minutes. I glanced back at Reed, but he was already fading into the tree line again. Disappearing with that soldier's instinct for vanishing before questions can be asked, before anyone can pin down exactly what they saw. I packed up my gear and walked toward the main tent where my father stood near the catering tables, checking his watch like time itself owed him obedience. He looked sharp, powerful, completely unaware that his ghost from Syria was walking his property, that the truth he'd buried was rising from its grave. "Everything on schedule?" he asked without looking at me. "Almost," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "We should get perfect light for the ceremony. Golden hour coming up." He nodded, distracted by something on his phone. "Good. The photographers from the military publication are arriving later. Make sure your shots don't overlap with theirs. We'll curate what gets released to the press, what becomes part of the official record." There it was again, that obsessive need for control. Always about managing the story, shaping the narrative, never about simply letting truth exist on its own terms. As the rehearsal wrapped up, I noticed Tristan laughing with a group of officers, fitting perfectly into my father's world. He was polished, obedient, ambitious, the kind of man who would never question where money came from or what it cost. The kind of man who would maintain comfortable illusions rather than face uncomfortable truths. When Ilara joined him, she performed her usual role flawlessly. Smiled at the right moments, tilted her head at the appropriate angle, laughed at jokes that probably weren't funny. But every time Tristan touched her arm possessively, her body stiffened just slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The way someone braces for recoil when they hear a weapon being cocked. Later, when the guests finally dispersed and the house fell into temporary quiet, I found Ilara alone in the hallway, holding one of the rehearsal bouquets like it was evidence of a crime she hadn't yet committed. "You saw him," she said quietly, not looking at me. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried the eerie calm that comes after panic has burned itself out, after fear has become so constant that it transforms into numbness. Yeah, I said. I saw him. And I think you've been seeing him, or at least communicating with him, longer than you're admitting. She looked down at the flowers in her hands, her fingers tightening around the stems. He shouldn't have come. He's putting himself in terrible danger just by being here. If Dad finds out Alara, I interrupted, my voice harder than I intended. Reed's not the only one in danger. Her eyes lifted to mine, filled with something between fear and defiance, between resignation and desperate hope. You don't understand, Callie. Dad's not just protecting the company. He's protecting himself from prison, from losing everything he's spent his entire life building. He'll destroy anyone who threatens that. He'll use every resource, every connection, every ounce of power he has. And he has more power than you can possibly imagine. I wanted to ask what she meant specifically, wanted details and evidence. But she kept talking, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, words tumbling out like they'd been dammed up too long. They said Reed died in Syria, but I got a letter 3 months after the official casualty notification. No return address, no official military channels. He said he was alive, that he had proof about what really happened, that people needed to know the truth about Falcon Ridge's equipment failures. I burned the letter like Dad told me to. I actually burned evidence because my father ordered me to. You told Dad about the letter? I asked, my voice careful. She nodded, her expression hollow. He said it was an enemy psychological operation, that I'd put everyone at risk by even opening it. He said responding would make me complicit in whatever intelligence operation was targeting our family. And I believed him because... She trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. Because believing him was easier than accepting what his protection had really cost. I exhaled slowly, trying to process everything, trying to piece together the full scope of what I was uncovering. My father, the decorated war hero, actively suppressing evidence about his own contracts. My sister trapped between loyalty and love, between duty and truth. And me, the photographer who thought she was here to document a celebration, but who'd actually walked into something far more dangerous. Alara, I said carefully, if what Reed's saying is true, this isn't just about Falcon Ridge or company reputation. This is criminal. People died because of falsified reports. Families lost sons and daughters because someone decided profit mattered more than properly functioning equipment. She pressed the bouquet so tightly that petals fell to the polished floor, scattering like drops of blood against the white marble. And if you expose him, it destroys everything, she said, her voice rising slightly. Our name becomes synonymous with corruption. Mom's health deteriorates from the stress. You know, her heart's already weak. The company that feeds thousands of employees collapses. Everyone we know suffers. It's not as simple as choosing truth over lies. In the military, they teach you that moral clarity is black and white, good versus evil, right versus wrong, duty versus betrayal. But out here in the real world, where families and legacies and livelihoods complicate everything, all I could see was camouflage. Shades of grey masquerading as clear choices. When she walked away, I stayed behind in that hallway, staring at the fallen petals scattered across the marble floor. They looked disturbingly like blood against the pristine white tile, like evidence of violence in a crime scene photograph. That night, while the house slept, and even the security guards seemed to relax their vigilance, I opened my laptop and pulled up military databases I technically still had clearance to access. Old habits and active security credentials die hard. I searched for connections, Falcon Ridge plus Syria plus Corbett plus equipment failure. Nothing came up in public records. But deep in archived classified materials, buried under layers of bureaucratic language and redacted paragraphs, I found a familiar designation, Project Horizon. The file was marked as mission failure due to environmental factors beyond control. The signatures on the official closure report included Colonel Barrett Delaney, along with 3 other senior officers and 2 Pentagon officials. I sat there watching the cursor blink on my screen, feeling my pulse thrum steadily in my ears like a drumbeat counting down to something inevitable. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. My father hadn't just known about the problems. He'd signed off on burying them. Then, somewhere outside my window, a security light flickered on, triggered by motion. Through the glass, I caught a silhouette moving toward the side gate with practiced stealth. It was Reed again, moving like someone accustomed to infiltrating secured areas, He looked back once, briefly, like he knew I was watching, like he wanted me to know he was still there, still fighting, still refusing to let truth stay buried. Then he disappeared into the darkness beyond our property line. I closed my laptop slowly, the screen going dark. I wasn't sure yet whether I was protecting my family or documenting their downfall. But one thing was absolutely clear. Every photo I took from this point forward wasn't just wedding photography. It was evidence. And I had a responsibility to truth that went deeper than family loyalty, deeper than the Delaney Code I'd been raised to follow without question. The next morning arrived with the sound of helicopters circling overhead like mechanical vultures. News crews, probably, attracted by the political significance of this wedding. My father had invited half the state's power brokers, and wherever they gathered, the press inevitably followed, hungry for access and sound bites. I brewed coffee in the kitchen, watching the sunrise pour through the blinds in stripes of gold and shadow. The house was already alive with controlled chaos footsteps echoing through hallways, phones ringing with last-minute crises, event planners shouting about seating chart modifications and timeline adjustments. It sounded less like a wedding and more like a military operation, which I suppose it was in a way. Everything in our family eventually became a military operation. Alara came down the stairs looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her hair was already pinned up perfectly, but the dark circles under her eyes told the real story. She didn't say anything until she saw me at the counter with 2 cups of coffee ready. "You were up late," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion. "So were you," I replied, sliding one of the cups toward her. We didn't have to explain what we'd both been thinking about. The silence between us held all the words we couldn't risk saying out loud in a house that felt like it had ears in every corner. "He's alive, Alara," I said finally, keeping my voice low. "That's not something you can just pretend didn't happen. That's not something that goes away because it's inconvenient." She gripped the back of a chair like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "If Dad finds out I've known, if he realizes I've been in contact with Reed even briefly, it's over for everyone. Not just me. Everyone." "What does that even mean?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. "What is he threatening you with?" She swallowed hard, her knuckles going white against the chair back. "It's not threats. It's just reality. Falcon Ridge isn't clean, Callie. You already know that. What you don't know is how deep it goes. How many powerful people have stakes in keeping everything quiet? Tell me," I said. "Tell me what really happened." She looked at me for a long moment, weighing risks and consequences. Then, as if a dam had finally broken, she started talking. "They covered up the mission," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Reed had evidence emails, test results, internal memos. Proof that the equipment failure wasn't weather-related or due to enemy action. It was faulty armor plating from a batch that Falcon Ridge shipped under Dad's direct approval. Equipment that failed basic safety standards but got pushed through anyway because delays would have meant contract penalties. Would have damaged the company's reputation for on-time delivery." My hands tightened around my coffee cup. "And Reed was going to expose it." "He tried to," she said. "He filed reports through official channels. Followed protocol exactly. And that's why they sent his unit on that particular mission. They needed him gone, needed him silenced, needed the evidence he'd gathered to disappear along with him." "Are you saying they deliberately I couldn't finish the sentence?" "The implications were too monstrous. I don't know if Dad personally ordered it," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears she still refused to let fall. But he knew. After Reed's squad was reported as casualties, after the official investigation concluded it was unavoidable circumstances, I confronted Dad. Asked him directly if Falcon Ridge had anything to do with it. He looked me in the eye and said, "Sometimes soldiers die protecting things bigger than themselves." As if Reed's death was somehow noble rather than murder dressed up as operational necessity. "And Dad knew Reed survived?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "When that letter arrived 3 months later, when I showed it to Dad, he didn't seem surprised. Just angry. He told me that if Reed was alive, he was damaged, traumatized, that anything he said couldn't be trusted. He made me promise to never respond, never try to contact him. And then," she paused, her voice breaking slightly. "Then he arranged this marriage. To Tristan, to the Price family, to create a web of political connections so thick that no one would dare investigate Falcon Ridge for fear of damaging too many powerful people." My father's voice boomed from the hallway before I could respond, shattering our moment of honesty. "Alara, time for makeup." We're on schedule and we're staying on schedule. Her whole posture snapped back into performance mode instantly. Years of training overriding emotional truth. She straightened her dress, forced brightness into her expression, and walked toward the door. But she paused for just a moment, looking back at me with desperate eyes. "Please, Callie," she whispered. "Don't make things worse. Sometimes silence is the only protection we have." Then she was gone, leaving her coffee untouched on the counter, leaving me with the crushing weight of knowledge I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. I sat there for several minutes, staring at the steam curling above the abandoned mug, wondering how far my father would truly go to protect his empire. I'd seen officers bend rules before, had documented the small ethical compromises that become easier with each repetition. But this was different. This wasn't bending rules. This was orchestrating deaths and cover-ups, turning human lives into expendable variables in corporate calculations. An hour later, I was outside near the gazebo, ostensibly testing light for the ceremony, but really just trying to process everything Alara had told me. I wasn't expecting company, but I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. That distinctive sound of someone approaching who wanted to be heard rather than surprising me. Reed. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His face drawn, but his expression calm, with the focused determination of someone who'd made difficult decisions, and was now committed to following through regardless of consequences. He nodded toward the house. "You told her what you saw?" "She already knew," I said. "Knew you were alive, knew you were here." Knew a lot more than she's been admitting. He gave a tired smile that held more sadness than amusement. "Yeah, that sounds like her. Always trying to protect everyone else, even when it means destroying herself in the process. You're putting her in terrible danger by showing up here," I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "I'm trying to get her out of even worse danger," he countered. "The danger of spending the rest of her life trapped in a lie, married to a man she doesn't love, serving a family empire built on casualties she'll never be allowed to acknowledge." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, the kind soldiers use to transfer encrypted files. "This is everything I have," he said, placing it in my hand. "Internal reports from Falcon Ridge, photos from the mission, the original equipment failure analysis that was buried, correspondence showing your father knew about the problems months before my unit deployed. If this gets to the right people, if it reaches investigators who aren't already compromised, Falcon Ridge burns. The cover-up collapses. Truth finally comes out." I took the drive from him, feeling the weight of it despite how physically light it was. Such a small object to contain so much potential destruction. "You trust me with this?" I asked, genuinely surprised. He shrugged, the gesture carrying years of weariness. "You were the only person in your unit who ever called attention to discrepancies in official reports. Back when we deployed together briefly, you were the one who questioned narratives that didn't match what you'd actually witnessed. I figured that integrity meant something. I figured if anyone in the Delaney family might choose truth over loyalty, it would be you. I wanted to say his faith in me was justified. Wanted to promise I'd do the right thing. But my stomach twisted at the thought of what exposing this would mean for everyone I loved. "You think Alara can handle the fallout?" I asked quietly. "You think she can survive watching her family's name become synonymous with corruption and death?" He looked away, staring at the pristine facade of the house where my father was probably giving orders and maintaining the illusion of control. "I think she deserves to live without being owned by her father's guilt," he said finally. "I think she deserves the chance to make her own choices instead of just executing someone else's plan for her life." We stood in silence for a few seconds, the morning air filled with the distant sound of musicians warming up and caterers setting tables. Normal wedding sounds for a day that was anything but normal. "I didn't come back to ruin her life," Reed said quietly, his voice carrying genuine pain. "I came back because she saved mine once. When my unit was gone, when I was alone in hostile territory with no support, I had nothing left but her letters. The ones she'd sent before I deployed, before everything went wrong. Reading them over and over gave me a reason to survive each day. She reminded me that there was still something worth coming back for. Something about the raw honesty in his voice hit me harder than any dramatic declaration could have. This wasn't a calculated manipulation. This was a broken man trying to repay a debt to the only person who'd given him hope when he had every reason to give up. Before I could respond, a security guard appeared from behind the equipment tent, his expression suspicious. "Hey, you're not supposed to be in this area. This is a private event," Reed stepped back instantly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. Just leaving? My apologies. I blocked the guard's view slightly, pulling out my military credentials with practiced ease. He's with me. We're checking access routes for additional photography positions. Security consultation. The guard hesitated, clearly uncertain but not wanting to challenge someone with official-looking identification. He nodded slowly and walked off, speaking into his radio about the interaction. Reed gave me a look that was half gratitude, half warning. You're getting pulled deeper into this, he said. Once you start protecting me, once you start hiding evidence, there's no going back to neutral ground. I know, I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. But I'm tired of neutral ground. I'm tired of pretending that staying silent makes me innocent. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then disappeared again through the trees with that practiced ease that comes from years of evading capture. Once he was gone, I opened my camera bag and hid the flash drive under the foam padding, nestling it between lenses where casual inspection wouldn't reveal it. The irony wasn't lost on me, a photographer smuggling evidence inside her gear, using tools meant to capture truth to conceal it temporarily until the right moment for exposure. Inside the house, everything was moving with the precision of a military operation. My father had switched into full public relations mode, shaking hands with senators and giving brief interviews about partnerships and national security and American integrity. Watching him, I could see why people believed him. He radiated confidence, projected trustworthiness, spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent decades earning respect. I wanted to ask him about Project Horizon, about the armor plating that failed, about Reed Corbett and the soldiers who'd died because someone chose profit over safety. But I knew how that conversation would go. He'd look me straight in the eye with that unwavering commander's stare and say something like, "We don't air unsubstantiated accusations in public. Delaney's protect each other." And that would be the end of it, because questioning him wasn't just disagreement, it was betrayal of everything our family supposedly stood for. Instead, I focused on my assigned role, taking pictures, documenting faces, capturing truth while hiding it in plain sight, in images that would only reveal their full meaning to people who knew what to look for. As I framed another shot, I noticed Tristan with his groomsmen, laughing too loudly, checking his reflection in every available mirror. He looked like a man who'd just won an important contract, not someone about to commit his life to another human being. Everything about him screamed calculation rather than emotion. I moved closer to capture what was supposed to be a candid moment, and that's when I overheard him speaking to one of the Falcon Ridge executives, their voices low but not quite low enough. "After today, we'll have everything locked down permanently," Tristan said, his tone carrying satisfaction. "No more potential leaks, no more ghost stories threatening to surface. The family connection makes it politically impossible to investigate either company without massive collateral damage. Ghost stories." My hand trembled slightly as I took another picture, using the camera to hide my reaction. He was talking about Reed, about making sure that even if Reed came forward, no one would believe him. No one would dare pursue the truth because too many powerful people had too much invested in maintaining the lie. When I went upstairs one final time before the ceremony, Elara was getting the last touches on her makeup. She looked like porcelain beautiful, fragile, breakable. The makeup artist stepped out for supplies, leaving us briefly alone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive Reed had given me. "He asked me to give you this," I said quietly. Her eyes widened with something between fear and desperate hope. "What is it?" "Proof. About your father. About Falcon Ridge. About everything Reed's been trying to expose." She stared at the small device like it was a weapon rather than just data. "I can't. If they find it, then I'll hold on to it," I said, my voice firm. "But you need to know it exists. You need to know that you have options beyond what your father has planned for you." She finally met my eyes, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the exhaustion underneath. "What would you do if you were me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I thought about all the missions I'd photographed, all the moments before soldiers made impossible choices between following orders and doing what they knew was right. "I'd tell the truth," I said finally, "even if it cost me everything. Even if it meant losing the only family I'd ever known. Because silence has a cost too, and eventually it becomes more expensive than honesty." "You always were the brave one," she said, a sad smile crossing her face. "I'm not brave," I replied honestly. I'm just tired of pretending that honor means protecting comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. There was a soft knock on the door. My father's voice came through, commanding as always. Elara, time to go. Everything's ready. She took a deep breath, fixed her veil with hands that trembled only slightly, and stood up. The transformation was remarkable, from vulnerable woman to perfect bride in seconds, years of training allowing her to slip into the role she'd been assigned. Before she left, she whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear, "If I do this, if I actually marry him, everything changes. There's no going back." "Then maybe," I said carefully. "It's time something changed." She didn't respond directly, but I saw her hand tighten on the door handle, saw her shoulders straighten with something that looked almost like resolve. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway where my father waited. His expression proud and completely unaware that the perfect ceremony he'd orchestrated was balanced on the edge of collapse. Downstairs, the orchestra started warming up, filling the air with classical music that was supposed to sound elegant, but felt ominous. Guests filled their assigned seats in perfect rows. Photographers checked their equipment with professional efficiency. It was all happening with the inexorable momentum of a mission no one was prepared to stop. I slipped the flash drive into a hidden pocket in my camera strap, securing it carefully. Then I joined the other photographers outside, where golden afternoon light painted everything in shades of bronze and amber. The sun was at that perfect angle photographers dream about, warm, flattering, making everything look more beautiful than it actually was. Perfect light for creating perfect images. Perfect light for exposing hidden truths if you knew where to point your lens. As the bridal party lined up for their entrance, I focused on Elara one more time through my viewfinder. Her expression was carefully controlled, professionally neutral, giving nothing away. But I recognized that look from years of photographing soldiers. It was the same expression people wore when walking toward a battle they knew would change them forever, when facing a moment that would define everything that came after. They didn't expect to survive unchanged. They just hoped they'd survive at all. My camera clicked once, the sound soft and final and familiar. A mechanical sound that marked moments, that separated before from after, that created permanent records of transient truths. Somewhere in that quiet click, I realized the wedding wasn't the story I'd been hired to document. The real story was the cover-up I was about to help expose. The truth that had been buried under layers of official denial and family loyalty. The moment when silence finally became more dangerous than speaking. And I was standing at ground zero with a camera full of evidence and a choice I could no longer avoid making. The orchestra launched into the processional music, the familiar melodies signaling the start of the ceremony. Elara took my father's arm, and they began walking toward the altar with measured, practiced steps. The scene was beautiful in that manufactured way that expensive weddings achieve, every detail perfect. Every element coordinated, every moment choreographed for maximum visual impact. But underneath the surface beauty, I could feel the weight of secrets pressing down, threatening to crack the flawless facade. The ceremony moved with mechanical precision. The priest spoke about duty, faith, unity, words that sounded meaningful but felt hollow. When it came time for vows, Tristan's speech sounded exactly like what it was, a business proposal dressed in romantic language. Together we will honor our families and build something lasting that serves a purpose greater than ourselves, he said with practiced sincerity, his voice carrying to the back rows. We will strengthen the bonds between our families and continue the legacy of service that both the Delaney and Price names represent. Then it was Elara's turn. She unfolded a small piece of paper with hands that shook so slightly most people wouldn't notice. But through my telephoto lens, zoomed in close, I could see every tremor. Her lips parted. No sound came out for several seconds. The silence stretched uncomfortably, guests beginning to shift in their seats. My father's expression shifted from proud to concerned. Finally she spoke, her voice soft at first but growing stronger with each word. Sometimes doing the right thing means letting go of what everyone expects of you, she said, her words cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. Sometimes courage means admitting that the path you've been following leads somewhere you can't go. A murmur ran through the crowd like wind through grass. My father's smile froze, his body tensing. I could see him calculating, trying to determine if this was part of her planned speech or something else entirely. Elara continued, her voice gaining strength from some deep reservoir of courage she'd been hoarding for exactly this moment. I was raised to believe that loyalty means obedience, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on my father. That duty means never questioning authority. That protecting family means protecting secrets no matter what truth those secrets destroy. The murmuring grew louder. Tristan reached for her arm, his expression shifting from confident to alarmed. Elara, what are you? But I've learned something, she said, pulling away from him gently but firmly. I've learned that loyalty without truth doesn't protect anything. It just perpetuates harm. It transforms love into complicity. It makes all of us prisoners of lies we didn't create but choose to maintain through our silence. Before anyone could fully process her words, before my father could intervene, the massive screen behind the altar, installed for showing a sentimental video montage, flickered white, then black. Then suddenly, unmistakably, my photo appeared. The one of Elara and Reed. The image filled the screen for everyone to see her laughing, his hand on her arm, sunlight breaking through leaves like divine illumination of truth too long hidden. The crowd gasped collectively. The sound rippled through 300 guests like a shockwave. "Turn that off!" my father barked, his voice booming through the microphone that was still live, still broadcasting every word. "Turn it off now." But before anyone could reach the controls, more images appeared. Documents, reports, photos from Syria, equipment failure analyses, all the evidence from Reed's flash drive, somehow uploaded to the presentation system, displayed for everyone to see. Technical staff scrambled toward the control booth, but it was already too late. The truth was out, projected in high definition for senators and generals and corporate executives who'd spent years pretending not to see it. Tristan turned to Elara, his face draining of color, his composure finally cracking. "What is this?" he hissed, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "What have you done?" Her voice stayed steady, carrying a calm that only comes from finally releasing a burden you've carried too long. "The truth," she said simply. "I've told the truth." My father started moving toward the altar, his expression thunderous. But before he could reach Elara, my mother's voice cut through the chaos. She pushed through the confused crowd, her face pale but her bearing surprisingly composed. "Barrett, stop this," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "Stop it now." He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on Elara with barely contained fury. "Not here. This is not the time." "Yes, here," my mother interrupted, her voice rising with emotion I'd never heard from her before. "Yes, now, because you've lied to this family long enough." She turned to address the crowd, speaking with the desperate courage of someone who'd finally reached her breaking point. "You called it duty. You called it necessary sacrifice. You said you were protecting national security. But it was fear. Fear of losing your legacy, your reputation, your empire. And you covered up soldiers' deaths because you couldn't face the cost of your choices." The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the breeze seemed to have stopped, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Elara walked toward the microphone still on the altar, still broadcasting to everyone present. Her voice came through the speakers with crystalline clarity. "You all came here for a wedding," she said, addressing the hundreds of shocked faces staring back at her. "But this isn't a union. It's a cover-up. My father's company, Falcon Ridge Systems, falsified safety reports that cost American soldiers their lives." She paused, letting the words sink in. "One of those soldiers was Captain Reed Corbett. They said he died in combat. He didn't. He survived. And he's here today because truth doesn't stay buried forever, no matter how much power you use to dig the grave." 300 heads turned simultaneously, searching the crowd. People gasped, pointing, whispering. Near the edge of the assembled guests, partially hidden by an ornamental column, Reed stepped forward just far enough for everyone to see him, to recognize the face from the photos now displayed on the screen behind the altar. The entire world seemed to stop breathing. My father's voice broke through the stunned silence. "Security!" he shouted, his command presence returning. "Remove that man from this property immediately." Several security guards started moving toward Reed, but their steps were hesitant, uncertain. The evidence on the screen made them question their orders. The presence of federal badges in the crowd. I spotted at least 3 people who'd been standing strategically positioned throughout the venue made them pause completely. My father started walking toward Reed, each step measured and controlled despite the chaos erupting around him. He stopped a few feet away, and for a moment the two men simply stared at each other, the decorated colonel and the supposedly dead captain. The man who'd ordered the cover-up and the man who'd refused to stay buried. "You're trespassing, Captain," my father said, his voice cold and formal. "You should leave before this situation escalates beyond anyone's control." "Not trespassing, sir," Reed replied calmly. "Just alive. Inconveniently alive for certain people's carefully constructed narratives." My father's expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten infinitesimally. "You think anyone will believe you? A traumatized officer making accusations against a respected company. You're damaged, Corbett. Everyone can see that." "Maybe I am damaged," Reed said, his voice steady despite the obvious pain the admission cost him. "But that doesn't make me wrong. And it doesn't make you innocent. You think you can destroy what I've built?" My father's voice carried a note of something between threat and disbelief. "Everything I've sacrificed for, everything I've protected." Reed's jaw tightened. "I didn't survive Syria to protect your lies, sir. I survived because good soldiers don't deserve to die protecting corrupt contracts. I buried friends in that desert. Men who trusted you, who believed in Falcon Ridge's equipment, who died because someone decided profit margins mattered more than properly functioning armor. That's a debt you can't pay with speeches about honor." For several seconds they stood locked in confrontation, the weight of 3 years of buried truth pressing down on everyone present. Then something changed in my father's face. The color drained away. His hand went to his chest, fingers clutching at his shirt. His body tightened, his breath coming in short gasps. For a split second I thought it was acting, another manipulation. Then I saw his knees buckle, saw the genuine confusion in his eyes as his body betrayed him. He collapsed, hitting the ground hard. Someone screamed. Multiple people shouted for help. "Call an ambulance!" someone yelled with genuine panic. My mother dropped beside him instantly, her hands shaking his shoulder with desperate urgency. Barrett, look at me." Paramedics who'd been on standby for the wedding. Standard procedure for events this size with this many elderly attendees rushed forward with their equipment. They worked efficiently, checking vitals, administering oxygen, preparing him for transport. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, my father's eyes found mine across the chaos. For just a moment, the commanding officer facade dropped completely. What I saw underneath was something I'd never seen in him before: fear. Not of death, but of what he'd built collapsing while he was powerless to stop it. "The company," he managed to gasp. "Protect the—" But he couldn't finish. The paramedics were already moving him toward the waiting ambulance, my mother following close behind, her face a mask of controlled panic. Elara just stood there on the altar, her veil torn, her makeup smeared, surrounded by the wreckage of a wedding that would never be completed. I walked up beside her, my camera still hanging around my neck, forgotten for the first time all day. "He'll live," I said softly, though I had no medical training to back up that statement. It just seemed like something she needed to hear. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the confused murmur of 300 guests trying to process what they'd just witnessed. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want him to." "I know," I interrupted gently. "But you told the truth." "And sometimes truth has casualties too." She turned to look at me, her eyes red but dry. "What happens now?" I looked around at the scene, federal agents already moving through the crowd, identifying themselves, beginning to ask questions. Senators and generals making hurried phone calls. Guests streaming toward exits, eager to distance themselves from the scandal they'd just witnessed. The perfect wedding transformed into a crime scene. "Now," I said quietly, "everything changes." Elara dropped her bouquet. It hit the ground with a soft thud, white petals scattering across the platform. The sound was small, insignificant, but somehow it felt final, like the last note of a song ending. Then she turned and walked calmly down the aisle, through the stunned crowd. Sunlight cut through the open tent as she passed, illuminating her with that golden late afternoon light that makes everything look almost transcendent. No one stopped her. No one seemed to know what to say or do. For once in her life, Elara was truly free, walking away from the altar, not toward a husband, but toward whatever came next, carrying nothing but the weight of truth she'd finally found the courage to speak. I didn't feel guilty about capturing it with my camera. One final shot, Elara walking away, head high, surrounded by chaos but moving with purpose. the image of someone who'd just sacrificed everything for honesty and somehow looked more whole than she had in years. The ambulance siren had barely faded into the distance when the estate fell into a kind of stunned, heavy quiet. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes after something breaks so completely that no one knows how to respond. When the ground beneath everyone's feet has shifted and no one's certain anymore where it's safe to step. Press vans had already rolled up at the gates, kept back by security but close enough that we could see telephoto lenses poking through gaps in the fence. Reporters shouted questions at anyone wearing a suit or carrying camera equipment. I could hear the low buzz of news drones circling overhead, capturing aerial footage that would be on every major network within the hour. Inside the tent, people moved like they were trying not to make noise, as if sound itself might trigger another catastrophe. The smell of trampled roses hung heavy in the air, sweet and nauseating, mixed with expensive perfume and the metallic scent of panic. My camera strap dug into my neck, the weight suddenly unbearable. For once, I didn't raise my lens. There was nothing left to capture that wouldn't feel exploitative, that wouldn't cross the line from documentation into vulture journalism. Elara sat at one of the beautifully decorated tables near the aisle, staring at the spot where our father had fallen. Her veil was completely gone now, her hair undone and hanging in messy waves around her face. But her posture hadn't changed, shoulders back, chin up, that same military discipline she'd learned growing up under his command. Only now it looked less like poise and more like the shock that keeps people moving when their minds haven't caught up with trauma. Tristan was gone. So was his entire family. They'd left before the ambulance doors even closed, escorted by private security, probably already calling attorneys, and damage control specialists, and whoever else wealthy families call when their perfectly planned futures explode in their faces. My mother hadn't come back either. She'd gone with my father in the ambulance, clutching his hand the whole way despite everything she'd learned, despite the lies she'd finally stopped protecting. For all the years of silence, for all the complicity and willful blindness, she was still his soldier. Some loyalties run deeper than truth, deeper than betrayal, deep enough that even exposed lies can't fully sever them. I pulled a chair up beside Elara. Neither of us spoke for a while. Around us, staff quietly dismantled floral arrangements that had cost thousands of dollars, that no one would ever admire properly. They pretended not to listen, but I could feel their awareness, their curiosity barely contained behind professional detachment. When Elara finally spoke, her voice was completely flat, drained of emotion. "I thought he was invincible," she said, still staring at that spot on the ground. "My whole life he never showed weakness, never admitted mistakes, never seemed human enough to fail." I nodded slowly. We all did. That's what he trained us to believe. She stared at her hands, the massive engagement ring still on her finger, its diamonds catching light but somehow looking dull and lifeless. I don't even know what to feel anymore. He's my father. I hate him for what he did, for the lies he told, for the lives he destroyed. But I still love him, and I hate myself for still loving him. That's how loyalty traps you, I said quietly, speaking a truth I was only beginning to fully understand. It makes you think love means protecting people even from consequences they deserve. It convinces you that silence is kindness when really it's just cowardice dressed up as devotion. She looked at me then, her eyes red and swollen but empty of tears, like she'd cried herself dry sometime earlier when no one was watching. "You think I did the right thing?" I hesitated because the right thing was such a dangerously simple phrase for such a devastatingly complex situation. The right thing had destroyed our family's reputation. The right thing had probably cost thousands of people their jobs when Falcon Ridge collapsed. The right thing had put our father in the hospital and our mother into crisis. But the right thing was still the right thing. "You told the truth," I said finally, measuring each word carefully. "That's more than anyone else in this family has done in decades. Whether it was worth the cost." I trailed off, unable to finish that sentence honestly. "That's something only you can answer." She nodded slowly, then laughed once, a sharp, hollow sound that held no humor. "The truth destroyed everything we were. Everything I thought we were. It only destroyed what was already broken," I said. "We were just too committed to the performance to notice the cracks underneath." The clink of glass interrupted us. One of the servers was cleaning up untouched champagne flutes, his movements stiff and nervous, probably wondering if he'd still get paid for this disaster. I caught my reflection in one of the glasses, a woman in elegant clothing, camera around her neck, face drawn with exhaustion. I looked like someone who'd been through combat, which I suppose I had been in a way. This was just a different kind of battlefield. My phone buzzed insistently in my pocket. I pulled it out and watched notifications explode across the screen like artillery fire. Headlines that had already been published in the mere hour since the ceremony collapsed. Breaking news alerts, social media posts going viral, live footage circulating, Falcon Ridge cover-up exposed, during wedding meltdown retired, Colonel suffers heart attack after daughter's public accusation, military contractor under investigation after scandalous wedding confession, supposedly dead captain appears at wedding exposes corruption. It had been less than 90 minutes since Elara spoke those first words at the altar, and the world already knew everything. The carefully constructed narrative my father had spent decades building had been demolished in the time it takes to watch a movie. I turned the phone face down on the table, unable to look at it anymore. "It's everywhere," I said unnecessarily. "I figured it would be," Elara replied, her voice eerily calm. "That was kind of the point, wasn't it? Dad built his whole life around public image. Now the public finally gets an honest look at what that image was hiding." I watched her for a while before asking the question I'd been avoiding. "Did Lance know you were going to do it like that? The public confession at the altar?" Her eyes flicked up to me with something almost like defiance. "No. He told me to tell the truth someday, to find a way to speak up when it was safe. He just didn't think I'd choose to do it in front of 300 people with half of Washington's power structure watching." She paused, a ghost of a smile crossing her lips. "He wanted me to be careful, strategic, protected, but I was so tired of being careful, so tired of protecting people who didn't deserve it." "He's still here," I said, glancing toward where federal agents were conducting interviews. "I saw him talking to DoD investigators." "I know," she said softly. We both turned toward the far end of what had been the reception area. Reed stood with two men in dark suits who were clearly federal investigators, their Department of Defense badges hanging from their belts like warnings. I recognized the type immediately. Men trained to keep their faces professionally neutral while quietly dismantling other people's lives and reconstructing them as evidence. He was speaking calmly, gesturing occasionally, no doubt walking them through every detail of the cover-up he'd spent 3 years documenting. One of the agents handed him a small envelope. Reed opened it carefully, read whatever was inside, then folded it back with hands that trembled slightly. His face didn't move, but his shoulders dropped just a bit, like he'd been carrying weight for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like when it was finally lifted. When he looked up and caught me watching, I didn't look away. After everything that had been exposed, pretending seemed pointless. I stood and started walking toward him, my feet sinking slightly into grass that had been trampled by hundreds of guests, fleeing a celebration that had transformed into a scandal. The manicured lawn was destroyed now, torn up by high heels and dress shoes, littered with programs and rose petals that looked disturbingly like evidence at a crime scene. When I reached Reed, he gave me a quiet nod of acknowledgement. The agents had stepped away to make phone calls, speaking in low tones about warrants and testimony and criminal investigations. "Federal agents?" I asked unnecessarily, already knowing the answer. "Yeah," he confirmed. "They've been building a case for months. Turns out I wasn't the only one trying to expose Falcon Ridge. Just the most inconveniently alive." His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Elara's confession just took everything public in a way they couldn't ignore anymore. "So it's over?" I asked, though even as I said it, I knew that was naive. He shook his head slowly. "No, it's just starting. Investigations like this don't end neatly. There are too many powerful people invested in making sure evidence disappears. Witnesses recant, reports get buried in bureaucratic process. It'll take years to fully unravel. And families like ours." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete that thought. "Neither do families like ours," I finished for him. "The Delaney's don't go down quietly. We'll fight this with every resource we have. Every lawyer, every political connection." He almost smiled at that, but there was no humor in the expression. "I know. That's what I'm counting on, actually. The more your father fights, the more evidence comes out. The more he tries to protect the narrative, the more the truth surfaces." We both turned toward the mansion. My father's American flag still hung from the balcony railing, spotless and undisturbed, rippling faintly in the evening wind. The stars and stripes moved with ceremonial dignity, as if saluting a commander who wasn't coming home the same person who'd left that morning, as if witnessing the end of something that had seemed permanent. Reed looked at the flag for a long moment, then back at me. He's not the only one responsible, you know. Falcon Ridge had layers of protection investors, board members, military liaisons, congressional oversight committees that chose not to see what they didn't want to know. Exposing him means exposing all of them. This is going to get a lot uglier before it gets better. I'd thought about my father's face as he fell, the pride crumbling, the fury mixing with disbelief, the absolute certainty that he was right being shattered by his own body's betrayal. He wasn't a villain in his own story. He thought he was a patriot protecting something sacred. He'd convinced himself that the lies were necessary, that the cover-up served a greater good, that some deaths were acceptable prices for maintaining order. Maybe that was the scariest part, how easily good people convince themselves that terrible choices are actually noble sacrifices. What happens to you now? I asked Reed, genuinely curious about what comes after you destroy the lies that defined your entire existence. He shrugged, the gesture carrying years of accumulated weariness. I'll testify at the hearings. Help the federal investigators clean up the mess. Maybe write a book nobody will read about what actually happened in Syria. He trailed off, staring at the disaster of scattered chairs and abandoned decorations. After that, he couldn't seem to finish the thought, as if the future beyond justice was too uncertain to imagine. Do you still love her? I asked bluntly, too tired for diplomatic language. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely certain. That never stopped. But sometimes love has to wait until the battlefield's clear, until the smoke lifts enough to see who's still standing and what's actually worth rebuilding. I looked back toward the tent where Elara stood alone, still staring out toward us with an expression I couldn't quite read from this distance. For a moment, none of us moved, three people bound together by truth and wreckage, by secrets exposed and futures uncertain. Then the sound of helicopters cut through the air again. Not emergency vehicles this time, press choppers hovering lower now, trying to catch the perfect aerial shot of the fallen dynasty, the ruined wedding, the scandal that would dominate news cycles for months. I stepped back instinctively, looking up. The wind from the rotors whipped through what remained of the flower arrangements and silk banners, scattering everything my father had built across the grass like confetti from a funeral. Rose petals lifted and swirled in the artificial wind, dancing through the air like snow or ash, beautiful and destructive at once. Reed turned to leave, pulling his jacket tighter against the downdraft. Take care of her, he said, not quite looking at me. She's going to need someone who understands why she did this. Someone who won't try to convince her it was a mistake. I will, I promised. He paused, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder. And Callie, thank you. For showing her that photo. For giving her permission to be honest. Sometimes people need to see evidence that truth is possible before they can find the courage to speak it. Then he walked away without looking back, his figure growing smaller as he headed toward the federal vehicles parked beyond the property line. He didn't disappear into shadows this time. He walked in full view in broad daylight, like someone who'd finally earned the right to exist openly. When I returned to Elara, she didn't ask what Reed said. She didn't need to. She just whispered, "He's gone again, isn't he?" "For now," I said, sitting back down beside her. "But this time he's walking toward something better. Toward justice, toward truth, toward a life that isn't defined by what he's running from." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the flag still fluttering above us. "Maybe this time we all are." The sun was dipping lower now, casting the estate in long, dramatic shadows that stretched across the lawn like ghosts of what had been. The military banners, the floral arches, the champagne tables, the empty chairs arranged in perfect rows. It all looked like the ruins of a monument built on lies, like an archaeological site of a civilization that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Somewhere beyond the gates I could still hear reporters shouting questions, their voices blending with the hum of evening cicadas. None of them would get the full story, I realized. They'd get headlines, dramatic quotes, sensational footage. But they'd never understand what it actually cost to tell the truth when the lie was literally all you'd ever known. When speaking up meant destroying the only family you had, disappointing people you loved, becoming the villain in everyone else's carefully constructed story. Elara reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. I squeezed back. We survive. We figure out who we are when we're not performing for someone else. We learn what the Delaney name means when it's not propped up by lies. That sounds hard. It is, I admitted, but it's real. And I think that's what we both need. Something real, even if it's difficult. And we stood there together, sisters bound by blood and shared trauma, watching as the last light faded from the sky. The helicopters slowly departed, their mechanical thunder replaced by the kind of silence that comes when a legacy finally collapses under its own weight. Not with a bang, but with a long, exhausted sigh. The week after the wedding felt like living inside a trial that was being broadcast on every channel simultaneously. My family's name had transformed from respected military legacy into cautionary tale about corruption, loyalty, and the devastating cost of choosing silence over truth. The phrase Delaney wedding scandal trended on social media for 5 straight days. I didn't have to explain who I was anymore when I went out in public. People already knew. Some recognized me with sympathy, others with judgment, most with that uncomfortable curiosity people have when they see someone whose private tragedy has become public entertainment. The footage from that day circulated endlessly, analyzed and reanalyzed by commentators and investigators. The photo of Alara and Reed shown on that massive screen. My father's collapse captured from multiple angles. The confrontation between Reed and my father replayed in slow motion on cable news. Everyone had an opinion. Conservative networks called Alara brave. Others called her a traitor to her family. Nobody really knew what it had actually taken for her to say those words out loud, to stand at that altar and choose truth over everything she'd been raised to value. Falcon Ridge Systems went into full crisis mode within hours. Their attorneys released carefully worded statements denying everything, blaming malicious attacks and disgruntled former employees. But within 2 weeks, whistleblower reports surfaced online documents Reed had handed over to federal investigators years ago, pages he'd kept hidden and protected, waiting for the right moment. They were real, detailed, devastating. Equipment test results that had been falsified. Approval signatures from people who'd never actually seen the gear. Email chains discussing ways to minimize bad publicity rather than fix actual problems. It didn't take long for the Department of Defense to announce a comprehensive audit. Congressional oversight committees suddenly remembered they had responsibilities. The company's stock value tanked spectacularly. Major contractors started terminating relationships, desperate to distance themselves from the growing scandal. My father's signature appeared on several of the most damning falsified reports. His authorizations clear and undeniable. His military medals, once framed proudly in our front hallway like sacred relics, were now plastered across investigative documentaries on cable news networks. His face appeared next to terms like criminal negligence and willful endangerment and conspiracy to defraud. Everything he'd built was being dismantled in public, examined, judged, condemned. He survived the heart attack, though it took weeks of intensive care. But he didn't come home. He stayed in a private ward at Walter Reed Medical Center. His room constantly monitored, his phone and computer confiscated by federal marshals. His every visitor logged and reported. The military had placed him on indefinite administrative leave pending the outcome of multiple investigations. They called it temporary relief from duties. Everyone else called it what it actually was, a slow, methodical dismantling of his entire career and reputation. My mother stayed by his bedside day and night, maintaining the same loyal devotion she'd shown throughout their entire marriage. She called me once during that first week, her voice low and exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. "He doesn't talk much anymore," she said, the words coming slowly like they hurt to speak. "He just stares out the window at the parking lot. Sometimes I think he's rehearsing excuses, practicing explanations for God or whoever he thinks he'll eventually have to answer to." "How are you holding up?" I asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I spent 38 years believing in him, believing in us, believing that everything he did was for something bigger than just ego or profit. Finding out I was wrong about all of it. It's like discovering your entire life was built on sand and now it's just..." She couldn't finish. Alara didn't visit the hospital. Not once. She'd drawn that line firmly and refused to cross it no matter how much pressure came from family friends who didn't understand. She moved into a small apartment downtown, somewhere near the river where she could hear water instead of helicopters. I helped her unpack boxes full of half her old life mixed with pieces of one she hadn't quite figured out how to build yet. She kept her wedding dress folded carefully in a black garment bag, tucked in the back of her closet, not because she wanted to remember the day, but because she couldn't bring herself to throw away something that had cost so much, not in money, but in courage, in sacrifice, in the destruction of everything she'd thought was permanent. The world around us didn't stop spinning just because our family had been flattened. People still went to work, still got married, still posted pictures of their perfect lives on social media. But for us, time felt different, stretched thin and heavy simultaneously. Every day lasted longer, felt quieter, was full of questions that didn't have easy answers, and decisions that came with consequences we couldn't fully predict. One morning, about 3 weeks after the wedding, I went to see Reed. He was living out near Quantico now, working directly with the team of investigators handling the expanding Falcon Ridge case. When I arrived at the modest apartment complex where he'd been staying, he was sitting at a small desk positioned near a window. Papers spread across every available surface. Evidence logs, witness statements, military correspondence dating back years. The documentation of truth slowly being assembled from fragments. He looked up when I knocked, his expression shifting to surprise and then something gentler. "Didn't expect visitors today," he said, standing to open the door wider. "Especially not Delaney's." "I was in the area," I lied. Though we both knew Quantico was 90 minutes from anywhere I had legitimate reason to be. "You drove an hour and a half to be in the area," he said. And I could hear the gentle amusement in his voice. "That's some impressive rationalization, Callie." He was right, but I didn't admit it. I sat down across from him at the desk, glancing at the files spread out like pieces of a massive puzzle. "How bad is it?" I asked, gesturing at the paperwork. "The full scope of it?" He sighed, the sound carrying years of frustration and determination. "Worse than I initially thought. They falsified at least a dozen major equipment reports. Some of that defective armor went to active combat units, overseas Marines in Kandahar, Army units in Baghdad, Navy personnel on forward operating bases. This wasn't just negligence or cutting corners to save money. This was systematic fraud that directly cost lives." "And my father signed off on all of it?" I asked. Though I already knew the answer. He approved the shipments, authorized the reports, signed the certification documents. Reed paused, choosing his words carefully. Whether he personally knew the full scope of the falsifications or whether he deliberately avoided knowing. That's what they're trying to prove. But at minimum, he created a culture where truth didn't matter as much as maintaining contracts and protecting company reputation. The words felt heavy but accurate. I'd seen enough of my father's management style to know that asking uncomfortable questions wasn't encouraged in Falcon Ridge's corporate structure. Loyalty meant not creating problems, and creating problems meant reporting anything that might damage the company's standing. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the desk lamp and distant traffic. The ordinariness of the setting felt surreal given what we were discussing: lives lost, careers destroyed, truth buried, and finally exhumed. "Are you angry?" I asked finally, breaking the quiet. "At my father? At the whole situation? At what this cost you?" He looked up, genuinely surprised by the question. "At your dad specifically? At the system that protected him? At everything it cost me?" He thought for a long moment before answering. I was angry for a long time. Furious, actually. The kind of rage that keeps you awake at night planning revenge scenarios you'll never actually execute. But anger like that, it turns into something else when you carry it long enough. It becomes perspective. Maybe even purpose. I let that sink in, understanding what he meant. Rage was exhausting. Purpose was sustainable. "You sound like someone who's forgiven him," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was an observation or an accusation. He shrugged, the gesture philosophical rather than dismissive. "Forgiveness isn't really about him, is it? It's about me refusing to let him own what's left of my life. It's about taking back control of my own story instead of letting his choices define every chapter." He paused, meeting my eyes directly. "I can acknowledge what he did without letting it consume everything I am. That's not forgiveness exactly. It's survival." Outside, a helicopter passed low overhead, military rather than press this time, the sound shaking the windows in their frames. Reed didn't even flinch. I realized how many terrible sounds he'd already learned to live with: explosions, gunfire, the helicopter rotors that had evacuated what was left of his unit. One more mechanical noise was just background now. He closed one of the files carefully and looked at me directly. How's Ilara doing? Really doing? Not the public statement version? She's trying, I said honestly. Sleeping too much. Not talking enough. Staying in her apartment like the outside world might swallow her whole if she ventures out too often. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. Tell her she did the right thing, okay? Tell her that what she did at that altar took more courage than anything I did in 3 years of hiding and gathering evidence. She already knows, I said. She just doesn't feel it yet. Knowing something is right and feeling okay about it are two completely different things. Yeah, he agreed quietly. Yeah, they are. When I finally left his apartment, he walked me out to my car in the parking lot. The afternoon sun was harsh, making everything look overexposed and washed out. You think my father will actually face criminal charges? I asked, one hand on my car door. Or will he just fade away quietly with a generous settlement and a strict non-disclosure agreement? Reed considered the question carefully. Maybe he'll face charges, maybe not. Men like him, with their connections and resources and understanding of how the system protects powerful people, they don't usually go to prison. They retire quietly to consulting positions with friendly companies. They get stripped of titles and public honors but keep their pensions. They're forgotten gradually rather than held accountable dramatically. He gave me a small, sad smile. But their ghosts keep working. You know, the truth they tried to bury keeps surfacing. The families of the soldiers who died keep asking questions. And maybe this time, because you and Ilara refused to stay silent, maybe this time we caught one of those ghosts before it could disappear completely. On the drive back to Austin, the highway looked endless grey asphalt stretching to the horizon, flat Texas landscape broken only by occasional signs and rest stops. I rolled down the window despite the heat, letting the wind cut through the silence. Needing something raw and real after hours of carefully modulated conversations about trauma and justice. The air smelled like approaching rain and sun-baked concrete, like the weather itself couldn't decide what it was doing. Back at my apartment, my phone buzzed with another voicemail notification. I'd been avoiding most calls, letting them roll to voicemail where I could process them emotionally before deciding whether to respond. This one was from my mother. Her voice sounded older than I remembered. Worn thin by stress and sleepless nights. Callie, sweetheart. He's asking for you. Your father. He won't admit it directly, but I can tell he wants to see you. If you're willing, if you think you can handle it, you should come soon. Before. She didn't finish that sentence, but the implication was clear. Before something changed irreversibly. Before forgiveness became impossible. Before death made all our unresolved conflicts permanent. It took me 2 full days to decide. 2 days of staring at my phone, of starting texts I couldn't finish, of weighing duty against self-preservation. Finally, on a grey afternoon when the clouds hung low and threatening, I drove to Walter Reed. The hospital smelled like every hospital antiseptic and sickness hidden under industrial cleaners. My father's room was on the 4th floor, in a secure wing where federal patients stayed. I had to show ID 3 times just to reach his hallway. When I finally walked into his room, he was sitting propped up in bed, thinner than I'd ever seen him, pale in a way that made him look fragile. Something I'd never associated with my father before. The television mounted across from him was muted, but still running a news story about Falcon Ridge, more evidence uncovered. More congressional hearings scheduled. He turned it off with the remote when he saw me standing in the doorway. Callie, he said quietly. His voice stripped of its usual command, softer than I'd heard in years. I nodded, pulling a plastic chair closer to his bed, but not quite close enough to touch. Dad, you didn't have to come, he said, though his eyes told a different story. I know. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. The machines around him beeped softly, monitoring vitals, recording the slow, steady rhythm of his recovering heart. Outside the window, I could see the parking lot, ordinary cars coming and going. Ordinary people living ordinary lives that didn't include national scandals and family implosions. Finally, he took a slow breath and spoke. I don't expect forgiveness, Callie. I know what I did. I know what it cost. He paused, the words clearly difficult. But I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. Protecting the company, protecting jobs, protecting the mission. I convinced myself that some sacrifices were necessary for the greater good. Yeah, I said, my voice harder than I intended. You did. And that's exactly the problem. You convinced yourself so thoroughly that deaths became acceptable losses as long as they protected your bottom line and your reputation. He looked down at his hands, the veins visible like blue wires under paper-thin skin. They're going to take everything. My pension, the house, probably my freedom if the charges stick. None of that really matters anymore. He looked up, meeting my eyes with something that might have been genuine remorse. What matters is your sister. You need to make sure this doesn't define her forever. Make sure she knows she can build something beyond this disaster. I stared at him, wondering if that was actual remorse or just another version of control dressed up as paternal concern. She doesn't need me to save her, I said firmly. You taught us that much, how to be self-sufficient, how to survive under pressure. She'll figure out her own path. Maybe for the first time in her life. It'll actually be her path instead of one you designed for her. His lips pressed into a faint, sad smile that held no happiness. Then maybe I did one thing right in all this mess. Maybe I taught you both to be strong enough to survive even me. When I left 30 minutes later, I didn't say goodbye. The word felt too final, too much like closure when nothing about this situation felt even close to resolved. I just walked out of that sterile room, down the antiseptic hallway, out into evening air that tasted like approaching thunder. That night, I sat at my desk and opened my camera files from the wedding for what felt like the 100th time. Every photo was still there, perfectly exposed, technically flawless, documenting the slow, spectacular implosion of a family built entirely on carefully managed appearances. But there was one picture I kept returning to obsessively, that shot of Ilara laughing with Reed, caught in a moment of genuine joy before everything exploded. It was the first time I'd captured something truly real that day. The first honest emotion in hours of performed perfection. Everything else was just evidence, documentation of a crime scene. But this one image showed something worth remembering, worth protecting, worth fighting for. I printed that photo on high-quality paper and pinned it carefully to my wall above my desk. For the first time since the wedding, looking at it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like proof that even in the ugliest truth, even in the most painful honesty, there's still something worth remembering, something worth preserving. Outside my window, a plane passed overhead, cutting through the clouds with steady purpose. I watched it disappear into the darkening horizon and thought about perspective, about how fragile and small everything looks from high enough altitude. How conflicts that feel world-ending from ground level become just small dramas when viewed from sufficient distance. Maybe that's what real perspective actually was, seeing how small we all ultimately are once the noise fades and the drama settles. Understanding that even our biggest mistakes and most painful choices are just human-sized after all. I leaned back in my chair, staring at that photo pinned to my wall. For years, I'd believed the camera's primary job was to make things beautiful, to capture life in its most flattering light. Now I understood something deeper. The camera's real job wasn't about beauty at all. It was about truth, documenting what actually was rather than what we wished it could be. And truth, no matter how painful, no matter how destructive in the short term, was the only thing that could possibly outlive the comfortable lies we built our lives around. A year later, I found myself standing in Virginia Beach with sand crunching under my boots and cold ocean wind tugging at my jacket. The sky was that washed-out winter blue you only get after rain has cleared the air completely. My camera strap slapped lightly against my shoulder, familiar weight that had become part of me. Ilara was standing a few feet away, barefoot in the wet sand despite the temperature, laughing at something Reed had said. He was carrying supplies for their event, a fundraiser for veterans struggling with PTSD, one of the programs their non-profit had launched 6 months earlier. They looked like two people who had fought their way through literal fire and somehow learned how to breathe normally again, how to exist without constantly looking over their shoulders for the next catastrophe. The world had moved on, the way it always does. Falcon Ridge Systems was still technically under investigation, though the criminal proceedings had been reduced to civil litigation that would probably drag on for years. The headlines had faded, replaced by new scandals, new disasters, new moral failures that captured public attention. My father had resigned quietly, stripped of his military decorations and his government contracts. He spent most of his time now in a rehabilitation center outside San Antonio, reading old military memoirs and ignoring calls from the few reporters still interested in his story. My mother stayed close to him, her loyalty somehow unshaken even by undeniable truth. Some habits I'd learned never die. Some bonds are so fundamental that even betrayal can't completely sever them. She'd made her choice to stand by him, and I'd made my peace with that choice even if I didn't fully understand it. But Alara had transformed completely. She'd built something genuinely new from the ashes of everything that burned. Her non-profit called Homeward Light, after months of brainstorming, helped veterans reintegrate after combat. They offered therapy, temporary housing, art programs, peer support groups. All the things military bureaucracy never quite managed to provide adequately. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Our family had once buried truth about dying soldiers. Now she was literally saving the ones still fighting to survive their service, still struggling with wounds both visible and hidden. I raised my camera and focused on her as she adjusted a banner that kept flapping in the steady ocean wind. The lens caught her mid-smile, sunlight reflecting in her eyes with that particular quality of light you only get near water. The photo was perfect, not because it was polished or professionally staged, but because it was completely authentically real. No performance, no masks, just genuine happiness caught in a fraction of a second. "You still hiding behind that camera?" Reed asked, walking up beside me with his easygoing smile that had taken months to fully return. "Better than hiding behind carefully constructed lies," I replied with a grin. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Fair point. Touché." He was different now, too calmer, more grounded, like someone who'd carried impossible weight for so long that putting it down had fundamentally changed their center of gravity. The federal investigation had officially cleared his name, recognized him as a whistleblower rather than a troublemaker, restored his military honor with formal apologies from officials who'd originally buried his reports. He didn't wear the uniform anymore, though. Said he'd had enough of chains disguised as duty, enough of systems that valued obedience over truth. "How's the photography business treating you?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Busy," I said honestly. "Turns out people want authenticity now. They're tired of perfectly staged fakeness. Truth finally got trendy, which is probably the most ironic thing about this whole disaster." He laughed again. "You started that trend, you know. You and Alara. You made honesty visible in a way people couldn't ignore anymore." "Hardly," I protested. "We just stopped pretending. There's a difference between starting a trend and just finally admitting what was always true." Alara walked over then, brushing damp sand from her casual dress. Her feet still bare despite the chill. "We need a group photo before the guests show up," she announced. "Think you can make us look good, Callie?" I lifted my camera with mock solemnity. "I'll make you look honest. That's the best I can do. Beauty is negotiable, but honesty is mandatory." She rolled her eyes but smiled anyway, pulling Reed beside her with comfortable familiarity. They stood close, shoulders touching naturally, his hand resting on her arm like it had always belonged there. I snapped several shots in quick succession, watching them through my viewfinder. In one frame, her head was thrown back mid-laugh, joy completely unguarded. In another, his hand rested gently on her shoulder while they both looked toward the ocean, toward whatever future they were building together. Each image captured something I'd spent years trying to photograph but had rarely succeeded in documenting. Genuine connection untainted by performance or expectation. When I lowered the camera, Alara asked with knowing amusement, "You're keeping those for yourself, aren't you? Not just for the event documentation." "Maybe," I admitted. "Photographer's privilege. I get to keep the shots that actually matter." She gave me that mischievous grin I remembered from childhood. From before military discipline replaced spontaneous joy, before our father's expectations crushed casual happiness. "Do you ever talk to him?" she asked quietly, the question carrying weight despite its simple phrasing. I hesitated, considering how honest to be. "Sometimes. He sends letters, now short ones, carefully written. They read like apology memos from someone who's forgotten how to express real emotion. Lots of 'I regret' and 'in retrospect', but not much actual acknowledgement of harm caused." "Does he sound sorry?" she pressed. "He sounds human," I said after thinking about it, which is honestly new and maybe more important than sorry. Like he's finally grasped that he's not some heroic figure in an inspiring story. Just a flawed person who made catastrophic choices and has to live with consequences. Alara nodded slowly, staring out at the horizon where grey ocean met grey sky. "I used to think forgiveness was weakness. Like forgiving someone meant you were letting them off the hook, giving them permission to never change." She paused, choosing words carefully. "But I think maybe forgiveness is actually the only thing that keeps you from turning into the people who hurt you. It's how you break the cycle instead of just perpetuating it with different victims. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, I said firmly. It doesn't mean pretending harm never happened or that consequences don't matter. No, she agreed quietly. It means learning to live and build and love in spite of it. It means refusing to let their choices determine our entire futures. Reed was helping volunteers set up tables behind us, pretending not to eavesdrop but definitely listening. He caught my eye briefly, gave me a small two-fingered salute and went back to work. That simple gesture said more than words could have: acknowledgement, respect, shared understanding of what we'd all survived. For a while, none of us spoke. The waves filled the silence with their ancient, steady rhythm. Patient and persistent, the air smelled like salt and freedom and possibility, like starting over without the weight of inherited lies. I turned my camera toward the water and started shooting again, capturing everything around me. Kids playing near the shore, their laughter carried on the wind. Volunteers unloading supplies, working together towards something constructive. A retired sergeant kneeling beside his therapy dog, both of them looking somehow healed by each other's presence. Each shot felt lighter than anything I'd photographed in years. Like I was finally capturing life instead of documenting damage. Like I was witnessing recovery rather than just recording trauma. Elara walked up beside me again, watching the volunteers work. "Remember that day?" she asked softly. "The wedding?" "Not something you forget easily," I replied. She smiled faintly, her expression peaceful rather than pained. "I don't regret it anymore. The fallout, the headlines, the humiliation, all of it." She paused, searching for words. "It all led here. To this. To something actually meaningful. Maybe that's what truth does when you finally speak it. It breaks absolutely everything, so you're forced to build something better from the pieces." "You built something worth keeping," I said, gesturing at the event taking shape around us. "So did you," she countered. "You're telling stories that matter now. Stories that help instead of just maintaining comfortable illusions." I didn't say anything, but I understood what she meant. After the scandal broke, after our family name became synonymous with corruption and cover-ups, I'd expected my photography career to collapse. Instead, something unexpected happened. Clients started seeking me out specifically not for glamorous staged perfection, but for honesty. Military families wanted authentic documentation of their lives. Veterans wanted portraits that captured truth rather than propaganda. People who'd lived through real loss wanted photographers who understood that beauty and pain could coexist in the same frame. One of my favorite recent shoots had been at a small Marine base in North Carolina. A young corporal and his fiancée wanted engagement photos before his next deployment. They'd specifically requested no fake smiling, no pretending it's not hard. We shot them standing in front of a C-130 transport, hands clasped, eyes steady, expressions carrying both love and the weight of uncertain future. No posing, no manufactured joy. Just two people choosing each other despite knowing how complicated that choice made everything. When I showed them the final images, his fiancée had cried and said, "That's the first picture that looks like us." Like really us, not who we're supposed to pretend to be. That was the moment I fully understood that my work wasn't about capturing perfection anymore. It was about creating proof evidence that truth and beauty could coexist, that honesty didn't have to be ugly. That real emotion was more powerful than any carefully staged performance. Now, watching my sister hand out flyers for her veteran support programs, I felt that same quiet clarity. The past wasn't something you escaped by running or denied by lying. It was something you worked through, examined honestly, learned from painfully. And sometimes, if you were lucky and brave enough, you transformed it into something that actually helped instead of just perpetuating cycles of harm. A strong gust of wind lifted the banner again, nearly knocking it completely loose from its supports. Reed grabbed it just in time, laughing as Elara rushed over to help him secure it properly. They worked together with practiced ease, clearly accustomed to handling small crises as a team. I snapped another photo almost instinctively, framing them against the open sky. The shutter clicked softly, that familiar mechanical sound that had become the soundtrack of my life. Final. Present. Real. Elara looked up at me, squinting against the bright, overcast light. That one felt special somehow. "It is," I agreed. "Want to see?" I turned the camera around to show her the screen. The image was beautifully simple. Elara and Reed caught mid-laugh, working together to control the flapping banner, sunlight breaking through clouds to spill across their faces. Behind them, the banner's text was partially visible, Homeward Light. There was nothing posed about it, nothing planned or staged. Just two people who'd walked through hell, confronted terrible truths, sacrificed everything comfortable, and somehow found themselves on a beach building something meaningful from wreckage. Just two people who'd chosen honesty over security and were slowly discovering that the choice, despite its cost, might actually have been worth it. Her eyes glistened as she studied the image. That's the one. That's the shot you're keeping? Yeah, I said simply. That's your freedom shot. That's what courage looks like after it stops being dramatic and just becomes living. She looked at the image for a long moment, her finger hovering over the screen without quite touching it, as if physical contact might somehow break the spell. You should title it that, she whispered. Freedom. So people know that's what they're seeing. Already did, I said, before you even asked. Later that afternoon, as guests began arriving and music started drifting across the beach, I stepped back from the organized chaos. I positioned myself on a low wooden fence near the dunes, camera resting quietly in my lap, just observing rather than constantly documenting. Elara moved through the crowd, greeting people, veterans, donors, volunteers, local officials showing support. She hugged people with genuine warmth, shook hands with actual connection, laughed without that performative edge that had characterized her entire life before the wedding. Reed moved beside her with comfortable confidence, the ease of someone who'd stopped constantly looking over his shoulder, who'd finally allowed himself to believe he might have a future worth planning for. They didn't need me to capture anything else, I realized. They were living it now rather than just performing it. And maybe that was the real definition of freedom, not needing someone to document your happiness because you were too busy actually experiencing it. I sat on that fence, camera silent, watching the ocean stretch endlessly in front of me. The horizon shimmered where water met sky, blurring the line between sea and clouds until everything became shades of grey and silver. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something terrible to happen. Didn't feel like I needed to stay constantly vigilant, always watching for the next catastrophe. I just felt present. Here. Real. When I finally packed up my camera bag an hour later, I slipped one printed photo inside carefully a copy of that freedom shot. I didn't plan to publish it professionally or sell it to news outlets still occasionally asking for exclusive content. It wasn't for headlines or commercial purposes. It was for us. For what truth had cost and what it had slowly, painfully given back. It was proof that honesty, despite destroying everything comfortable, could eventually create space for something better. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose, Elara called out, "You leaving already, Callie?" "Yeah," I said, shouldering my bag. "You've got this covered. You don't need me documenting anymore." "Thank you," she said, walking over to hug me tightly. "For everything. For seeing me. For showing me that truth was possible even when it felt impossible." I smiled and returned the hug. Just doing my job. Documenting what's real instead of what's comfortable. But I knew it was more than that. The job had stopped being about pictures months ago. Now it was about bearing witness. About seeing what was real and making sure it didn't disappear under layers of convenient denial. It was about proving that truth could be documented. That honesty could be visible. That courage looked like ordinary people making extraordinarily difficult choices and somehow surviving the consequences. I walked up the sandy path toward my car, the sound of laughter and music fading behind me, replaced by the constant rhythm of waves and wind. Before I got in, I turned back one final time, unable to resist the photographer's instinct. Elara and Reed were standing near the waterline now, holding hands loosely, framed by the orange-gold light of the setting sun. For half a second, I almost lifted my camera again. The shot was too perfect to miss, too beautiful to leave uncaptured. But I didn't. I just stood there watching with my own eyes rather than through a lens. Some moments don't need to be photographed to last forever. Some moments are more powerful when you let them exist only in memory, when you trust your own perception instead of mechanical documentation. And maybe that's what real freedom actually looks like, being so present, so grounded, so honest that you don't need constant proof that good things can happen. You just let them happen and trust yourself to remember. I got in my car and drove away slowly, watching them grow smaller in my rearview mirror until they were just silhouettes against the ocean, until they became part of the landscape rather than separate from it. until they simply belonged to that beach, that moment, that hard-won peace they'd fought so desperately to create. And as I merged onto the highway heading home, I realized that this helping someone find their way back to truth, documenting the moment freedom became possible. This was the most important photograph I'd ever not taken.